Cassidy Rowan had always believed that moving into Silver Pines would be the beginning of a quieter, more fulfilling chapter in her life. After years of working as a sought-after interior architect in bustling downtown areas, she longed for a home that felt like a genuine retreat, a place where the rustle of trees would replace the constant thrum of traffic, and where late-night meetings would give way to leisurely evenings on a back porch. When she first drove through the stone gates of Silver Pines, she had been instantly charmed. The streets wound gently around small parks and ponds. The houses were tasteful without being ostentatious, and the residents, at least at a glance, seemed friendly enough. It appeared to be the perfect environment to slow down, breathe, and reconnect with a part of herself that had gotten buried under project deadlines and corporate expectations. It was during one of her early morning walks, only days after moving in, that Cassidy first met Thomas Everett. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a wiry frame that moved stiffly but determinedly. She noticed immediately that he walked with a prosthetic limb, a lightweight, high-tech model that gleamed slightly in the morning light. They exchanged polite greetings at first, casual nods of acknowledgement as they passed near the community pool where Thomas would do his morning laps. Over time, however, their interactions grew into short conversations. Cassidy, learning that Thomas had been a chemistry teacher for over 30 years before an accident on an icy highway had changed the course of his life forever. He never spoke of it with bitterness. Instead, there was a certain quiet acceptance in the way he told his story, as though it were just another equation he had solved and moved past. Silver Pines prided itself on maintaining certain standards. This Cassidy quickly understood, but she had not anticipated how rigidly those standards could be enforced. There were posted rules for everything: lawn heights, mailbox styles, acceptable paint colors, even specific hours when residents were permitted to use shared facilities like the pool or tennis courts. At first, these regulations seemed reasonable, even comforting in their thoroughness. Yet, as Cassidy settled into her new life, small, unsettling signs began to emerge that hinted at a deeper, more controlling atmosphere under the manicured surface. It started with whispered complaints at the mail kiosks, thinly veiled comments about who was bringing down the tone or not respecting the community's image. It was in the middle of one such whispered conversation, overheard entirely by accident, while Cassidy waited for a parcel, that she first heard the name Kimball Harper spoken with a particular mixture of fear and resentment. Kimball, as Cassidy would come to learn all too well, was not merely the president of the neighborhood association. She was the reigning monarch of Silver Pines, a figure who wielded the bylaws and regulations like a personal arsenal. A large, imperious woman with a penchant for brightly colored suits and an ever-present clipboard, Kimball was the kind of person who appeared to believe that rules were not just guidelines but sacred edicts. Even minor infractions like an improperly stored trash can or a non-standard holiday wreath were treated with the severity of criminal offenses under her watchful eye. Despite the increasingly obvious tension threading through the neighborhood, Cassidy tried to maintain a sense of neutrality. She had come here for peace, not conflict, and she was determined to avoid becoming entangled in community politics. Her job, which she continued to conduct remotely, consumed most of her attention, and she preferred it that way. Still, she made it a point to support Thomas whenever she could, often waving to him when she passed the pool and exchanging a few friendly words when their paths crossed. She admired his resilience, his unfailing courtesy, and the way he refused to let his disability define the terms of his life. But even Cassidy's careful diplomacy couldn't shield her from the gathering storm. The first real signs of trouble appeared when Kimball Harper proposed what she called necessary adjustments to the use of the community amenities during an otherwise routine association meeting. Cassidy had attended the meeting only because her neighbor, an affable widow named Marjorie Owens, had urged her to see how things worked around here. She had not expected to sit through an hour of tedious financial reviews only to be blindsided by a sudden motion to limit access to the pool for non-standard users, a thinly veiled reference to residents like Thomas, who sometimes needed extra time entering and exiting the water. Kimball presented the changes as being about efficiency and safety, layering her speech with carefully chosen phrases that made it seem as though she were only acting in the best interests of the community. But Cassidy could see the barely concealed disdain flickering behind Kimball's words, the subtle hardening of her expression whenever Thomas's name was mentioned. The new rules would effectively restrict Thomas to very narrow windows of access, times when the pool was often closed for maintenance or entirely deserted. It was a transparent attempt to push him out, to erase the inconvenience of his presence without ever acknowledging what they were truly doing. The motion passed with little opposition, most residents too indifferent, too intimidated, or too eager to avoid conflict to question it. Cassidy left that meeting with a sick feeling twisting in her gut, her initial optimism about Silver Pines already beginning to sour. She knew something fundamental about this place had been revealed in that room, a willingness to sacrifice the dignity of a neighbor for the sake of appearances. Determined to offer at least some support, Cassidy made a point of speaking with Thomas the next morning. He shrugged off the new rules with the same quiet pragmatism he brought to everything, though Cassidy could see the hurt in his eyes, the deep wound that no prosthetic could ever mend. "It's just the way things are sometimes," he said with a wry smile, his breath misting in the early morning air. "Not worth making a fuss over." Cassidy disagreed, but she respected his wishes. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that something ugly had been set in motion, that the careful balance of life at Silver Pines was tilting toward a place where decency mattered less than control. She began paying closer attention, noticing small signs of change. The way Kimball's patrols around the community became more frequent, how residents who had once waved now averted their eyes, how the rules seemed to multiply, creeping into every aspect of daily life. The final crack in the illusion came on an ordinary Thursday morning. Cassidy was carrying a to-go coffee from the small shop at the entrance to the community, savoring the first real taste of fall in the air when she heard raised voices near the pool. She paused, heart sinking, and turned the corner just in time to see the confrontation unfold. Kimball Harper, her bulk looming larger than ever in a too-tight pastel blazer, was standing toe-to-toe with Thomas, her face twisted in an expression of self-righteous fury. Cassidy couldn't hear every word, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, commanding, dismissive. Thomas, for his part, remained calm, even as he tried to explain himself. The confrontation escalated quickly, too quickly for Cassidy to intervene, and without warning, Kimball stepped forward and slammed her shoulder into Thomas's chest, sending him staggering backward across the slick poolside tile. It was a moment frozen in time, the kind of thing you can never unsee. Thomas, thrown off balance by the combination of the push and the instability of his prosthetic, crashed hard onto the concrete, his arm flailing uselessly for purchase before landing with a sickening thud. For a heartbeat, no one moved. A couple sitting under a nearby umbrella gasped audibly. A mother, gathering towels for her children, stopped mid-motion, her face pale. Cassidy felt the coffee cup slip from her fingers, forgotten as it tumbled to the ground. Kimball, instead of rushing to help or expressing any semblance of concern, stood over Thomas with a look of grim satisfaction, adjusting her blazer as if brushing away invisible dust. She barked something about respecting authority, before turning sharply on her heel and marching toward the clubhouse as though nothing at all had happened. Cassidy didn't think. She acted. Racing across the pool deck, she knelt beside Thomas, already assessing the damage through the haze of her fury and disbelief. His face was twisted in pain, his breath shallow, one hand clutching at his side. Other residents slowly began to gather, hovering uncertainly at a distance, torn between the instinct to help and the fear of getting involved. This, Cassidy realized with a sick certainty, was the real face of Silver Pines, The smiling facades, the perfect lawns, the endless rules, all of it a brittle shell hiding a rot that would sacrifice anyone who didn't fit the mold. And now, as she looked into Thomas's pain-stricken face and heard the murmurs starting to ripple through the gathering crowd, she knew without question. They couldn't ignore this. Not this time. The moments following the incident at the pool blurred together in Cassidy's mind, but some things she remembered with painful clarity. She remembered the look on Thomas's face as he tried to sit up, the way he stubbornly bit back a groan of pain rather than show weakness in front of the gathering crowd. She remembered the cold, hard set of Kimball Harper's shoulders as she walked away without so much as glancing over her shoulder. Most of all, she remembered the stunned silence that enveloped the pool area, the way the neighbors froze in place, uncertain whether they should intervene, pretend nothing had happened, or simply melt away before anyone asked them to take a side. Cassidy did not allow herself to hesitate. She helped Thomas to his feet, steadying him with an arm under his good shoulder as he grimaced and leaned into her for support. She could feel the tremors running through his body, not just from the pain but from the humiliation, the raw vulnerability of having been assaulted so publicly. Without waiting for anyone to offer help, she guided him slowly across the pool deck, careful to match his halting steps, and led him toward the small bench near the clubhouse entrance. A few residents trailed behind them at a distance, whispering urgently among themselves but making no move to approach. Once Thomas was seated, Cassidy crouched in front of him, her voice low and steady as she asked where he was hurt. He waved her off with a shaky hand, insisting he was fine, that it was nothing a little ice wouldn't fix. But Cassidy wasn't fooled. She could see the tightness around his mouth, the shallow breathing, the way he winced every time he shifted. His prosthetic leg, though intact, seemed to be sitting at an odd angle, and his left arm hung loosely at his side in a way that suggested more damage than he wanted to admit. Refusing to waste another second, Cassidy pulled out her phone and called for an ambulance. She ignored Thomas's weak protests, ignored the murmured conversation starting to build among the onlookers, ignored the tremor of anger she could feel rising in her own chest. When the dispatcher asked for details, Cassidy gave them in a clipped, professional tone. Male, late 60s, fall with possible head and back injuries, location confirmed. She added in a deliberate, icy voice that the fall had been caused by a physical altercation with another resident. The dispatcher promised help was on the way within minutes. Thomas sat stiffly, eyes fixed on the concrete at his feet. Cassidy stayed by his side, glancing occasionally at the small knots of neighbors still hovering nearby. Some looked genuinely concerned, others merely curious, but none dared to come closer. No one wanted to be seen choosing a side. Not here, not when Kimball Harper's influence loomed so large over the community. It disgusted Cassidy, this cowardice masquerading as prudence, but she understood it. Fear was a powerful thing, and Kimball had cultivated it expertly. The wail of sirens in the distance cut through the heavy silence, and within minutes a fire truck and ambulance pulled into the parking lot beside the clubhouse. Cassidy stood as the EMTs approached, quickly briefing them on what had happened while Thomas submitted to their examination with stoic resignation. She stepped back, giving them space to work, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. A police cruiser rolled in behind the ambulance, and Cassidy felt a small, grim satisfaction at the sight. At least there would be an official record now, something that couldn't be swept under the rug with a few muttered apologies and a donation to the community fund. The paramedics determined that Thomas needed further evaluation at the hospital. There was too much risk of internal injury, and his prosthetic might have been damaged. As they loaded him onto the gurney, Thomas caught Cassidy's hand and squeezed it once, briefly but with surprising strength. She smiled down at him, doing her best to project reassurance she didn't entirely feel, and promised she would follow behind in her car. While the ambulance pulled away, one of the police officers, a young man whose name tag read Mason, approached Cassidy and began asking standard questions. What had she witnessed? Who was involved? whether there were other witnesses. Cassidy answered everything as clearly as she could, her voice calm but firm. When Mason asked whether Thomas wished to press charges, she hesitated only briefly before explaining that Thomas was being transported to the hospital and might not be in any condition to make statements yet. Mason nodded thoughtfully and scribbled notes into his pad, promising to follow up with Thomas once he was cleared by medical staff. By the time the formalities were completed, most of the crowd had dispersed, melting away back into their homes, leaving only the faint traces of their unease hanging in the heavy afternoon air. Cassidy stood alone in the parking lot for a long moment, breathing deeply, trying to settle the pounding in her chest. She was not afraid, at least not for herself, but she understood the machinery they were about to set in motion. Kimball Harper would not take this lightly. She would fight back, not through open aggression but through the insidious bureaucratic channels she had long ago mastered. Cassidy climbed into her car and headed toward the hospital, her mind already racing ahead. There would be paperwork, statements, medical reports. There would be meetings, committee hearings, whispered threats, and no doubt retaliatory inspections and complaints. It would be ugly, and it would be exhausting. She hated the thought of dragging Thomas through any more hardship than he had already endured, but after what she had seen today, she knew there was no turning back. To ignore this, to pretend it hadn't happened, would be a betrayal of everything decent. At the hospital, Cassidy waited until Thomas was settled into a treatment room before checking in with the attending nurse. She was relieved to hear that his injuries, though painful, were not life-threatening. Severe bruising, a strained shoulder, and some minor abrasions. The prosthetic was intact but would need recalibration. When Thomas was finally allowed visitors, Cassidy stepped quietly into the room and found him lying back against the pillows, looking tired but alert. He greeted her with a small, lopsided smile, the kind of smile that tried to make light of the unbearable. "They say I'm still in one piece," he quipped, his voice hoarse. Cassidy pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "That's good," she said softly. "But this isn't over, Tom. You know that, right?" He sighed heavily, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I know," he admitted, "but I don't want to make it worse for everyone. You saw how they looked at us. Half of them won't even meet our eyes now." "That's exactly why we can't let this slide," Cassidy replied, her voice low but fierce. "If we do nothing, she wins. She'll think she can treat anyone who's different like garbage. And next time, it might be someone even more vulnerable." Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling. When he spoke again, his voice was steady. "What do we do?" Cassidy didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to rush headlong into a crusade without thinking it through. She didn't want to expose Thomas, or herself, to more retaliation than necessary. But she also understood that passivity would only invite more abuse. They needed to be smart, deliberate. They needed help. "We start by documenting everything," she said finally. "The paramedics' report, the police statement, your medical records. We build a case that even she can't wriggle out of. And we find witnesses, quiet ones, if we have to, people who saw what happened and are willing to put it in writing." Thomas nodded slowly, the flicker of a new resolve lighting behind his tired eyes. "And if no one wants to come forward?" Cassidy allowed herself a small, grim smile. "Then we find another way. She's built her little empire on fear and intimidation. But empires like that have a way of crumbling when enough cracks start to show." The ride home later that evening felt heavier than the drive to the hospital. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and perfect hedges of silver pines, turning the picturesque community into something brittle and hollow. Cassidy could almost feel the eyes behind the drawn curtains, the weight of silent judgment pressing against her as she pulled into her driveway. Inside her house, she set about gathering her thoughts, pulling out her laptop to start drafting a timeline of events while everything was still fresh. She made notes on the confrontation, the injuries, the immediate reactions of the people present. She saved everything to multiple backups, determined not to let anything slip through the cracks. Before going to bed, Cassidy stepped out onto her back porch and stood in the cool night air, looking up at the stars. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint hum of a car engine and the soft slam of a door. Life in Silver Pines went on, as though nothing had changed. But Cassidy knew better. The facade had cracked. The real Silver Pines, the one ruled by fear and silence, was starting to reveal itself, and she was no longer willing to be part of that silence. Cassidy Rowan had always considered herself a patient person, someone who preferred methodical planning over impulsive reactions. But the days following the incident at the pool tested every ounce of her restraint. It did not take long for the community to react, though not in the way she had naively hoped. The initial shock of witnessing a respected neighbor violently knocked down had worn off quickly, replaced by a thick, sticky unease that clung to every conversation and every glance exchanged across front lawns. Residents who had once waved easily now offered tight, uncomfortable smiles or averted their gazes altogether. Thomas Everett's injury had become a ghost haunting Silver Pines, a subject discussed only in hushed voices behind closed doors, if at all. The message was clear. People were afraid, not necessarily of Thomas or Cassidy, but of what standing with them might cost. True to form, Kimball Harper wasted no time in asserting her version of events. Within 48 hours of Thomas's fall, Cassidy found a thick envelope stuffed into her mailbox, bearing the cold, impersonal letterhead of the Silver Pines Community Board. Inside was a formal notice, written in the stilted, overly legalistic style so favored by bureaucracies that know they are in the wrong but cling to procedure like a shield. The letter informed Cassidy that she was being cited for causing unnecessary disruption at a community facility and violating decorum guidelines by engaging in confrontational behavior. There was no mention of Thomas, no acknowledgement of the injury, no acceptance of any responsibility. Instead, the blame was being quietly, methodically shifted onto those who had dared to acknowledge that something terrible had happened. Cassidy read the letter twice, her hands trembling with a mixture of fury and incredulity. It was a classic tactic, she realized, preemptive discrediting. If they could paint her as a troublemaker, an instigator, then anything she said in defense of Thomas would be tainted by association. It would no longer be about what Kimball had done. It would be about how Cassidy had overreacted or created division within the community. She was being isolated, just as Thomas was, cut off from the unspoken support structures that made suburban life bearable. It was a brilliant, cynical move, and it made her stomach churn. She refused to be intimidated. She contacted Officer Mason, the young policeman who had initially taken her statement, and requested a follow-up meeting. To her relief, he agreed, suggesting they meet at the local police station rather than at her home, citing the need for neutral ground, a phrase that carried a weight of its own. Cassidy spent the night before their meeting gathering every piece of documentation she could think of. Copies of the initial incident report, the medical evaluations from Thomas's hospital stay, detailed notes she had compiled about the atmosphere at the pool both before and after the incident. When she arrived at the station, she found Mason waiting in a small interview room, a manila folder already open in front of him. He listened patiently as she laid out her concerns, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing her to speak uninterrupted. Cassidy appreciated his professionalism, but she could sense his unease, the way he treaded carefully around certain topics. Silver Pines was not just another suburban neighborhood. It was an influential one, populated by wealthy retirees and mid-level politicians, the kind of place where stepping on the wrong toes could have career consequences. Still, Mason did not dismiss her. He confirmed that an official case number had been assigned to the incident and that Thomas's injuries had been documented thoroughly enough to support potential charges, should he wish to pursue them. However, he warned that the process would not be simple. Because the altercation had occurred on private property and involved community governance structures, any criminal proceedings would likely be complicated by civil counteractions. Cassidy understood immediately. They were trying to bury this in paperwork, to make the fight so exhausting and drawn out that she and Thomas would eventually give up. As she drove home from the station, Cassidy's mind raced. She realized they needed to be smarter, to anticipate every roadblock and prepare for every dirty trick Kimball and her allies might employ. They could not rely solely on the justice system to set things right. They needed allies, real ones, and they needed to find them fast. The first person she turned to was Marjorie Owens, the widow who had first encouraged her to attend the ill-fated community meeting. Marjorie answered Cassidy's knock with a wary smile, her eyes darting nervously up and down the street before ushering her inside. Over mugs of lukewarm tea, Cassidy laid out everything she knew, watching as Marjorie's face shifted from concern to anger to resignation. "You have to understand," Marjorie said quietly. "Most people here aren't bad. They're just scared. Kimball knows how to make life miserable for anyone who crosses her. She can fine you for imagined infractions, delay repairs on your home, block permits for renovations. She doesn't even have to break any laws. She just uses the system." Cassidy nodded grimly. She had seen enough already to believe it. "I'm not asking anyone to stand up and paint a target on their backs," she said. "But if there's anyone willing to write a private statement about what they saw, even anonymously, it could make a difference." Marjorie hesitated, biting her lip. Then she stood and disappeared into another room, returning a few moments later with a battered address book. "I can think of a few people," she said. "They won't want their names made public, not yet, but they're decent folks. They know what she did was wrong." With Marjorie's cautious network as a starting point, Cassidy spent the next several days carefully reaching out, arranging quiet meetings over coffee or walks through the less-traveled paths of the neighborhood. Some residents were too afraid to even entertain the conversation, shutting their doors politely but firmly. Others listened with tight, pained expressions, offering non-committal answers that said everything Cassidy needed to know. But a few, just a few, agreed to write statements, brief but powerful accounts of what they had witnessed at the pool. By the end of the week, Cassidy had compiled 6 such statements, enough to build the framework of a case but still far from enough to guarantee victory. Worse, subtle signs of backlash had already begun to surface. A bright orange violation notice appeared on Cassidy's front door, citing her for unauthorized alterations to landscaping, a laughable charge given that she had done nothing but plant a few potted flowers. A neighbor who had once smiled warmly at her now crossed the street to avoid her. Rumors circulated that Cassidy was Sue-happy, litigious, not the kind of neighbor Silver Pines needed. Cassidy bore it all with a grim, growing determination. They were trying to wear her down, to isolate her until she had no choice but to give up or move away. But she would not give them the satisfaction. Every petty retaliation, every whispered smear campaign only hardened her resolve. Thomas, for his part, remained remarkably stoic. Though he hated being the center of attention, he agreed to meet with a civil attorney recommended by one of Marjorie's friends, a sharp-eyed woman named Ellen Price who specialized in disability rights cases. Ellen was blunt in her assessment. The incident at the pool represented not just assault, but a potential violation of federal protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act. She advised pursuing both criminal and civil charges, warning that the community board would likely try to settle quietly to avoid bad publicity. "Be prepared," Ellen said, looking Thomas squarely in the eye. "They'll offer money. They'll offer apologies. They'll act like they care about your well-being. But it's not about you. It's about preserving their image." Thomas nodded slowly, his mouth set in a thin line. "I'm not looking for a payout," he said. "I just want them to admit what they did." Cassidy sat beside him, feeling a surge of fierce pride. She knew how much it cost him to fight, how much easier it would have been for him to retreat into the background, to let the world roll over him like it had so many times before. But he wasn't backing down. Neither was she. As the first formal demand letters were drafted and sent, Cassidy felt the tension in the community ratchet up several notches. The polite facades grew brittle. Casual interactions became charged with suspicion. Kimball, sensing the shift, redoubled her efforts to control the narrative. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards and in mailboxes, warning residents about false accusations, threatening the harmony and safety of Silver Pines. Cassidy recognized the tactic immediately, sowing doubt, painting themselves as victims of an unjust attack. It might have worked had it not been for one final, fatal misstep on Kimball's part. Perhaps emboldened by her previous success at silencing dissent, perhaps simply overconfident, she staged a public town hall meeting under the pretext of discussing community unity initiatives. Cassidy attended, sitting quietly in the middle row, notebook in hand, as Kimball stood at the podium and launched into a carefully crafted speech about the dangers of outsiders and individuals who seek personal gain at the expense of communal peace. Kimball never mentioned Cassidy or Thomas by name. She didn't have to. Every word, every thinly veiled accusation was pointed directly at them. And then, perhaps pushed by her own arrogance, she crossed a line. She began recounting the incident at the pool, but her version was grotesquely distorted, painting Thomas as aggressive, Cassidy as disruptive, and herself as the victim of harassment. It was too much. From the back of the room an unexpected voice rose. Marjorie Owens, frail but fierce, stood up and interrupted Kimball mid-sentence. "That's not what happened," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "And you know it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. For the first time, the brittle unity Kimball had so carefully cultivated began to crack. Cassidy sat back, heart pounding, knowing that the real fight had only just begun. The ripple created by Marjorie Owens's sudden stand against Kimball Harper at the community meeting did not dissipate the way Cassidy feared it might. Instead, it began to spread, slowly but steadily cracking the carefully maintained facade of Silver Pines. For a few heart-stopping moments after Marjorie spoke, the room had been frozen in stunned silence, as if no one could quite believe that someone had dared to challenge the unspoken hierarchy. Kimball, standing rigid at the podium, had smiled tightly, her knuckles whitening around the edges of her clipboard. But for once, she had no immediate rebuttal, no polished response designed to steer the narrative back under her control. She muttered something about differing recollections and hastily concluded the meeting, but the damage was already done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and there was no pulling it out. In the days that followed, Cassidy noticed small but significant shifts in the atmosphere around Silver Pines. Neighbors who had once looked away now offered tentative nods of acknowledgement. An elderly couple who lived 2 houses down from Thomas dropped off a handwritten card wishing him a speedy recovery. The community bulletin board, previously dominated by notices about landscaping regulations and bake sales, now bore an anonymous flyer urging residents to stand for truth and fairness. It was a subtle rebellion, but in a place so obsessed with order and appearances, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Cassidy and Thomas, guided by Ellen Price's sharp legal mind, moved carefully. They were acutely aware that Kimball and her allies would be looking for any excuse to discredit them further, any misstep that could be twisted into evidence of instability or malicious intent. Ellen advised against any public confrontations or emotional appeals. Instead, she focused on building an airtight case, affidavits from witnesses, medical documentation, a formal timeline of events meticulously cross-referenced with community records. Every piece of evidence was gathered, cataloged, and prepared with the precision of a surgical operation. What Cassidy did not anticipate, however, was how hard Kimball would fight back. It began with a sudden wave of compliance inspections, thinly disguised harassment aimed at anyone suspected of sympathizing with Thomas and Cassidy. Minor infractions were cited and fined aggressively. Grass deemed too long by an inch, mailboxes slightly out of regulation, porch lights too bright according to newly minted guidelines. The message was clear. If you stood against the ruling powers of Silver Pines, your life would be made unbearably difficult. Cassidy's own property was not spared. She received 3 separate violation notices within a week, each more ludicrous than the last. One accused her of unsightly potted plants on her front porch. Another claimed her mailbox was improperly maintained because of a faint scratch in the paint. And the third cited her for conduct unbecoming of a community member, for the simple act of filing a formal complaint. Ellen helped her contest each citation methodically, filing appeals and demanding written justifications, but the paperwork alone became a form of warfare, draining time, energy, and emotional resilience. Despite the pressure, Cassidy remained focused. The growing number of quiet supporters bolstered her spirits, and the knowledge that Thomas refused to retreat gave her purpose. They were not fighting for personal glory or vengeance. They were fighting for the principle that no one, not even someone as entrenched as Kimball Harper, should be allowed to abuse their power unchecked. The turning point came when Ellen uncovered a critical piece of information buried deep within the Community Association's own records. While reviewing the minutes from previous board meetings, documents most residents never bothered to request, let alone read, Ellen discovered a procedural error that Kimball's regime had overlooked. According to the Silver Pines bylaws, any significant change to community rules, including adjustments to facility access policies, required not just a board vote, but a full community referendum with a minimum participation threshold. The rule change that had restricted Thomas's pool access, the very rule Kimball had used to justify confronting him, had never been properly ratified. It was an illegal rule, null and void from its inception. Ellen's excitement was palpable when she called Cassidy with the news. "This is it," she said. "Not only does it undermine her authority regarding the pool regulations, but it also exposes her to legal liability for enforcing an unlawful rule. This isn't just a personal dispute anymore. It's a governance violation. We can take this to the county." Cassidy felt a surge of vindication, tempered by the sobering realization that exposing this would escalate the conflict to a new and dangerous level. Still, she knew there was no choice. Armed with Ellen's findings, she and Thomas prepared to file a formal grievance with the county's Office of Community Affairs, a government body responsible for oversight of homeowner associations and similar governing entities. Filing the grievance was an act of war, and Cassidy knew it. Word spread quickly through Silver Pines that outside authorities had been brought in, and the backlash was swift. Kimball and her closest allies began holding secret meetings, gatherings to which only their most loyal supporters were invited. Cassidy overheard snippets of conversations at the local coffee shop, references to troublemakers, and people who want to destroy everything we've built here. The fear that had once silenced the community now fueled a simmering hostility, a desperate attempt to protect the status quo. In a calculated move, Kimball pushed for an emergency vote to amend the association's bylaws retroactively, attempting to cover up the procedural failure that Ellen had exposed. Flyers were distributed door to door, filled with alarmist language about outside interference and protecting community values. Cassidy and Thomas, through Ellen's guidance, responded with their own campaign, not through confrontational rhetoric, but through quiet conversations, factual explanations, and appeals to reason. They met with small groups of residents in living rooms and backyard patios, explaining calmly and patiently why the rule changes were illegal, why due process mattered, and why allowing unchecked authority would ultimately hurt everyone. It was not a dramatic battle fought in front of cameras or crowds. It was 1,000 small, wearying encounters, each one a chance to either gain or lose ground. Some neighbors turned away, unwilling to risk the wrath of Kimball's clique. But others listened. Others began to ask questions. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the tide began to shift. The day of the emergency vote arrived, and Cassidy stood with Thomas at the community clubhouse, watching as residents filed past the sign-in table. Some avoided their gaze, but others offered small nods of encouragement. The meeting itself was tense, the atmosphere thick with suspicion and barely concealed animosity. Kimball took the stage early, launching into a fiery speech about loyalty and unity, framing the entire controversy as an attack on the community itself. She spoke of outsiders sowing division and those who would tear down what generations had built. When it was finally Cassidy's turn to speak, she rose slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and addressed the room with calm clarity. She spoke not about grievances or personal vendettas, but about the rule of law, about fairness, about the simple principle that even leaders must follow the rules they impose on others. She did not accuse, did not insult, did not plead. She simply told the truth and trusted the residents of Silver Pines to recognize it. The vote was close, uncomfortably so, but in the end, Kimball's proposed amendments failed to secure the necessary support. The illegal rule changes would not be whitewashed. The county's investigation would proceed. Kimball, though she remained outwardly composed, radiated fury from every pore as she left the clubhouse in a huff, her entourage trailing behind her like a tattered procession. Cassidy sat back in her chair, exhausted but quietly elated. It was not a total victory. Not yet. There would be more battles ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time since that terrible day at the pool, it felt as if justice might actually be possible, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The failure of Kimball Harper's emergency vote did not end the conflict in Silver Pines. It simply drove it into darker, more insidious channels. Cassidy Rowan understood almost immediately that Kimball was not the sort of adversary who accepted defeat gracefully. In the days following the vote, the atmosphere in the community grew heavier, the smiles more brittle, the casual conversations more guarded. Silver Pines had always been a place where appearances mattered more than reality, but now the cracks were visible even to the most oblivious resident. The community was divided, not along simple lines of loyalty, but along deeper fault lines of fear, resentment, and silent defiance. Cassidy braced herself for retaliation, and it came sooner than she expected. It began with a series of anonymous complaints filed against her property. First, there was a notice accusing her of operating an unlicensed business out of her home, a claim that was laughable, given that her remote work involved nothing more than virtual meetings and design consultations. Then came allegations of noise disturbances, despite the fact that Cassidy's evenings were usually spent quietly reading or reviewing client blueprints. Each complaint required a formal response, an inspection, a hearing. Each one drained hours of her time and energy, forcing her to navigate a labyrinth of petty bureaucracy carefully designed to exhaust her resolve. Thomas Everett, too, became a target. Although he kept to himself and maintained his property meticulously, he received violation notices for absurd infractions, a hose left coiled improperly, a garden gnome deemed aesthetic pollution, and a flagpole bearing an American flag, allegedly installed without proper approval, despite records clearly showing it had stood there for over a decade. The message was unmistakable. You are not welcome here anymore. Cassidy met with Ellen Price regularly, reviewing their strategy and adjusting as needed. Ellen remained unshakable, a calm presence in the rising tide of hostility. She urged patience, reminding them that the county's investigation into Silver Pine's governance was still ongoing and that any overt retaliation by Kimball could be used to strengthen their case. But patience was not easy to maintain in the face of relentless low-grade warfare. Every violation notice, every hostile glance from a neighbor who had once been friendly, every subtle act of social exclusion chipped away at Cassidy's endurance. The situation escalated further when Thomas received a formal letter from the Silver Pines Board accusing him of being a disruptive influence and informing him that his community privileges, including access to the pool, were being suspended, pending a disciplinary review. The irony of it would have been almost laughable if it were not so cruel. The same community that had allowed Kimball Harper to assault a disabled man now sought to punish the victim under the guise of maintaining harmony. Cassidy sat with Thomas at his kitchen table, the letter spread out before them, a pot of untouched coffee growing cold between them. Thomas, usually so stoic, looked weary, defeated in a way Cassidy had never seen before. His shoulders sagged, and his gaze was distant, as if he were already withdrawing from the fight to protect what remained of his dignity. "I'm tired, Cass," he said quietly. "I'm tired of being the problem." "You're not the problem," Cassidy replied fiercely. "She is. They are. You didn't ask for any of this." "Maybe not," he said, a bitter smile flickering across his face. "But maybe I should just move. Start over somewhere else. Somewhere quieter." The thought made Cassidy's chest ache. It would be so easy for him to walk away, to disappear into another nameless suburb where no one knew his history, where he could exist without conflict. Easy and wrong. Running would only validate Kimball's tactics, would teach the entire community that silence and submission were the only viable responses to injustice. "You deserve better," Cassidy said. "We both do. And so do the people here who are too scared to stand up for themselves." Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the letter, his jaw tightening. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "We fight." It was not a grand declaration. It was a simple, exhausted acceptance of reality, and it was enough. With Ellen's guidance, they filed a formal appeal against the suspension of Thomas's community privileges. They requested a public hearing, knowing full well that Kimball would be forced to either justify her actions openly or reveal the pettiness and malice that underpinned them. In preparation, they gathered more witness statements, more documentation. Every violation notice, every retaliatory action was logged meticulously, building a mountain of evidence that could not easily be dismissed. But Kimball was not idle either. She counterattacked with a campaign of fear, summoning sympathetic residents to secret meetings where she framed Thomas and Cassidy as dangerous radicals intent on destroying the fabric of Silver Pines. Flyers reappeared on community boards and slipped under doors, warning of the threat to neighborhood values. A few bold supporters who had initially offered Cassidy quiet encouragement withdrew their backing, citing concerns for their own standing within the community. The pressure mounted relentlessly, and it culminated in a chilling incident that left no doubt about the stakes involved. Late one night, Cassidy returned home from a late meeting with Ellen to find her front porch vandalized. Someone had slashed her potted plants to ribbons, scattered garbage across her front steps, and spray-painted the word "traitor" in crude, dripping letters across her garage door. Cassidy stood frozen in the driveway, the keys clutched tightly in her hand, the bile rising in her throat. For a moment, she considered calling the police, but she knew exactly how it would be handled. A perfunctory report, a shrug, a polite but meaningless promise to increase patrols. No arrests, no real consequences. That was how power worked in places like Silver Pines. It cloaked itself in civility while condoning acts of cowardice from the shadows. Instead, Cassidy took a breath, pulled out her phone, and carefully documented every inch of the damage. She sent the photos to Ellen, who replied almost immediately with instructions on how to incorporate the vandalism into their ongoing case. Cassidy spent the next morning scrubbing paint off her garage door and replanting what could be salvaged of her flowers. She refused to show fear, refused to give Kimball or her sycophants the satisfaction of seeing her cower. When Thomas heard about the vandalism, he arrived at Cassidy's house with a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and a quiet, stubborn determination. He sat on her front porch for hours, a silent sentinel, his presence a message more powerful than any words. Cassidy didn't ask him to leave, and he didn't offer. They understood each other without speaking. They would not be driven out. The public hearing to address Thomas's suspension was scheduled for the following week, and Cassidy prepared herself for a battle unlike any she had faced before. It would not be fought with reasoned arguments or carefully presented evidence alone. It would be fought in the realm of perception, in the hearts and minds of neighbors who had been conditioned to value order over justice, comfort over courage. On the day of the hearing, the community clubhouse was packed to capacity. Residents crammed into every available seat, the air thick with tension and unspoken anxieties. Kimball sat at the front table, flanked by her loyal board members, her expression a carefully crafted mask of disapproval and righteous indignation. Cassidy sat with Thomas at a table facing the board, Ellen standing behind them with a slim folder of evidence tucked under her arm. The proceedings began with a recitation of the charges against Thomas, a litany of exaggerated complaints and baseless accusations dressed up in the language of procedure and propriety. When it was their turn to respond, Cassidy stood and addressed the room in a voice that was calm, steady, and implacable. She spoke not of emotion, but of facts. The illegal rule changes, the procedural violations, the pattern of retaliation. She presented photographs, witness statements, legal opinions. She laid bare the truth, brick by brick, until even the most skeptical listeners could not deny the rot festering beneath the manicured lawns and pristine facades. Thomas spoke next, his words quieter but no less powerful. He spoke of dignity, of belonging, of the simple right to exist without fear of harassment or exclusion. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked only for fairness. When they finished, the room was silent. Kimball attempted to rebut, but her arguments were brittle, defensive, laced with barely concealed venom. The contrast was stark, one side offering facts and principle, the other offering bluster and spite. The board recessed to deliberate, and the wait stretched into an agonizing hour. Finally, they returned with a decision. Thomas's suspension was overturned. His access to community facilities was fully restored. Moreover, the board announced that a formal review of governance practices would be conducted in light of the mounting evidence of misconduct. It was not a total victory. Kimball still held power, still had her loyalists, but it was a breach in the walls she had built. A breach that would only widen as the county investigation moved forward. Cassidy and Thomas walked out of the clubhouse that night, not as conquerors, but as survivors. They knew the war was not yet over, but for the first time, they could see the possibility of peace on the horizon. A peace built not on fear, but on justice. The weeks following Thomas's reinstatement were marked by a tense, almost surreal quiet across Silver Pines, a deceptive calm that masked the gathering storm. Cassidy Rowan knew better than to believe the battle was over. Kimball Harper might have suffered a public setback, but she was far from defeated, and the machinery of influence and fear she had built over the years would not crumble without resistance. The community continued to simmer with unease, the divisions between neighbors deepening into silent chasms. Some houses displayed subtle signals of allegiance, small American flags planted firmly in gardens as a show of support for Thomas, while others flew pristine community banners, a barely veiled signal of loyalty to Kimball's regime. Conversations became coded, wary, as if everyone was waiting for the next eruption. Cassidy spent her days in constant motion, coordinating with Ellen Price, following up with county investigators, and quietly building alliances among the residents who had grown disillusioned with Kimball's heavy-handed tactics. Every step was calculated, deliberate. She knew that emotion could not win this war. Only patience, persistence, and an unassailable mountain of facts could dismantle the false reality Kimball had worked so hard to construct. The investigation into the governance of Silver Pines moved slowly but inexorably forward, fueled by the evidence Cassidy and Ellen had so carefully assembled. Meanwhile, Thomas resumed his routines with quiet dignity, reclaiming his place in the community spaces he had been so cruelly pushed out of, though he moved with a wary caution that had not been there before. The final confrontation, when it came, was triggered not by a dramatic revelation but by the slow, grinding weight of accumulated truth. County officials, after reviewing the complaints and documentation, announced a formal hearing to determine whether the Silver Pines Board had violated local statutes governing community associations. The hearing would be public, open not only to residents but to the broader press, a fact that sent shockwaves through the insular world of Silver Pines. For a community that had prized its pristine image above all else, the thought of airing their dirty laundry in a public forum was nothing short of catastrophic. Kimball, sensing the danger, tried one last desperate gambit. She organized a community forum at the clubhouse, a thinly veiled attempt to rally support and preempt the county hearing with a show of manufactured unity. Cassidy attended with Thomas at her side, both of them fully aware that they were walking into a trap. The clubhouse was packed, the air humid with tension, the seats filled with residents whose faces revealed a complex mixture of fear, anger, and weariness. Kimball stood at the front, flanked by the few remaining loyalists who had not yet abandoned her sinking ship. She launched into a speech dripping with sanctimony, painting herself as a tireless servant of the community besieged by outside forces bent on sowing chaos. She spoke of tradition, of order, of the sacred duty to protect the values of Silver Pines. She never mentioned Thomas or Cassidy by name, but every veiled reference to troublemakers and opportunists was a pointed dagger aimed squarely at them. Cassidy sat silently, letting the performance unfold without reaction, her expression unreadable. She had prepared for this. She had rehearsed every possible line of attack, every manipulation Kimball might attempt. When Kimball finally opened the floor for questions, Cassidy rose slowly from her seat, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes settle upon her. She did not raise her voice or inject emotion into her words. She spoke with the calm precision of someone laying out incontrovertible facts. She asked Kimball, directly and publicly, why the board had implemented rule changes without the legally required referendum. She asked why violations were selectively enforced against certain residents but not others. She asked why Thomas's community privileges had been revoked without due process. She referenced statute numbers, specific clauses in the community bylaws, and excerpts from county regulations, each point meticulously cross-referenced with documented evidence. Kimball faltered. For the first time, the mask slipped. Her responses were defensive, evasive, laced with the brittle frustration of someone accustomed to wielding power without challenge. She tried to dismiss Cassidy's questions as misunderstandings, misinterpretations, but the damage was done. The room, once tense with hostility toward Cassidy, now buzzed with murmured conversations, residents exchanging uncertain glances. The illusion of Kimball's authority was crumbling in real time, undone not by shouting or outrage, but by the steady, relentless force of truth. When Cassidy finished, she returned to her seat beside Thomas, who gave her a small, approving nod. They had not won yet, but they had shifted the ground beneath Kimball's feet, and she knew it. The county hearing, held the following week at a neutral civic center outside the gates of Silver Pines, was a more formal affair. County officials presided from a raised dais, their demeanor impartial but attentive. Kimball appeared with legal counsel, her once imperious posture now tense, her expressions carefully controlled. Cassidy and Thomas sat with Ellen, surrounded by stacks of neatly organized evidence. Witnesses were called. Marjorie Owens, shaky but resolute, recounting the day Thomas was assaulted. Several residents who testified to the pattern of selective enforcement and retaliatory harassment. Even Officer Mason, who provided his official report of the pool incident. Each testimony built upon the last, weaving a damning tapestry of misconduct, abuse of power, and systemic intimidation. When it was Cassidy's turn to testify, she spoke clearly and methodically, walking the officials through the timeline of events, the violations of procedure, the personal and communal consequences of Kimball's reign. She answered every question without hesitation, her demeanor professional but never cold. She understood that winning this fight required more than just presenting facts. It required conveying the human cost of Kimball's actions. Kimball's defense, when it came, was a mess of contradictions and half-truths. Her lawyer attempted to reframe the issues as misunderstandings, blamed rogue members of the board, and at one point even implied that Thomas's disability made his version of events unreliable, a suggestion that elicited an audible gasp from the room and hardened the expressions of the county officials. After hours of testimony, the hearing adjourned for deliberation. The wait was excruciating, every minute stretching into an eternity. Cassidy sat rigid in her chair, resisting the urge to pace or fidget. Thomas sat beside her, hands folded tightly in his lap, his jaw set with quiet determination. When the officials finally returned, their verdict was clear and unequivocal. The Silver Pines Board had violated multiple statutes governing community governance. The illegal rule changes were nullified. Fines would be levied against the Association for Procedural Misconduct. Most significantly, Kimball Harper was formally removed from her position, barred from holding any leadership role within Silver Pines or any other community association governed by the county for a period of no less than 5 years. The announcement hit the room like a thunderclap. Kimball sat frozen for a moment, her face a mask of disbelief and rage, before gathering her belongings and leaving without a word, her loyalists trailing after her like a funeral procession. Cassidy exhaled slowly, the weight of months of struggle lifting from her shoulders. She turned to Thomas, who was smiling faintly, a rare expression of unguarded relief. It was over. Not the work. There would still be healing to do. Still repairs to the fabric of Silver Pines that would take time and patience. But the reign of fear was broken. The community could begin, finally, to rebuild itself on a foundation of fairness, decency, and mutual respect. And Cassidy, standing quietly beside Thomas as the residents began to murmur and stir around them, knew she had made the right choice all those months ago when she refused to look away. She had chosen to fight. And she had won. In the weeks that followed the county's decision, Silver Pines began a slow, painful transformation. It was not the kind of sweeping change that Cassidy Rowan might have envisioned in her more idealistic moments. Rather, it was a gradual, uneven shift marked by small acts of accountability and cautious optimism. The departure of Kimball Harper left a vacuum that could have easily been filled by another figurehead eager to wield power, but instead, something more organic began to take root. Residents who had once lived in fear of stepping out of line started to reclaim their voices, speaking up at meetings, questioning policies that had long gone unchallenged, and proposing reforms that focused not on control, but on community. The interim leadership appointed by the county was a modest, pragmatic group of residents who had no appetite for the theatrical displays of authority that had defined Kimball's reign. They focused on transparency, publishing meeting agendas in advance, soliciting genuine input from the community, and addressing concerns without threats or retaliation. It was not perfect. There were still arguments, still grudges simmering beneath the surface. But for the first time in a long time, the residents of Silver Pines began to believe that their voices mattered. Cassidy watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and weary caution. She knew how fragile progress could be, how easily it could be undone by complacency or renewed fear. She remained vigilant, attending meetings regularly, offering measured advice when asked, but otherwise stepping back to allow the community to heal itself. She had never sought to become a leader or a symbol. She had fought because she could not bear to stand by and do nothing, and now she understood that true change had to come from the people themselves. Thomas Everett, for his part, returned to his quiet routines, his presence at the pool no longer a source of controversy but a quiet testament to resilience. His gait was slower now, his movements more cautious, but there was a new steadiness in his bearing, a refusal to shrink himself to accommodate the narrow expectations of others. Residents who had once looked away now greeted him warmly, some even pausing to chat or offer words of support. It was not universal. There were still a few who muttered behind closed doors, but the tide had turned decisively in Thomas's favor, and he wore his hard-won dignity like armor. One afternoon, as the first hints of spring began to soften the winter-chilled air, Thomas invited Cassidy to sit with him by the pool. They settled into 2 lounge chairs side by side, the sun warm on their faces, the gentle ripple of water providing a soothing backdrop. For a long time, they said nothing, simply enjoying the quiet together, the simple pleasure of a space reclaimed from fear. "You did it, you know," Thomas said eventually, his voice low and thoughtful. "You made them see." Cassidy shook her head with a small smile. "We did it," she corrected. "And they saw because they were ready to see. They just needed a reason." Thomas chuckled softly. "You gave them a reason. A damn good one." They fell into silence again, each lost in their own thoughts. Cassidy felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Not the brittle, precarious kind she had first sought when moving to Silver Pines, but a hard-earned peace, tempered by struggle and loss, made stronger by the knowledge of what had been endured and overcome. Later that evening, the new community board held a modest ceremony at the clubhouse, a simple gathering to thank those who had helped guide Silver Pines through its most tumultuous chapter. There were no grand speeches, no lavish displays, just a series of heartfelt acknowledgments. When Cassidy's name was mentioned, she accepted the polite applause with humility, feeling no need for accolades. The real reward was the sight of Thomas smiling beside her, of Marjorie Owens standing proudly among the crowd, of neighbors once cowed into silence now speaking openly and without fear. As the ceremony wound down and residents lingered to chat and make plans for the future, Cassidy slipped away to the edge of the room, content to observe rather than participate. She knew her role here was coming to an end. She had helped to light the way, but it was not her place to lead them forward. They would have to do that themselves, and she trusted now that they could. Before she left, Thomas found her, handing her a small, neatly wrapped package. Inside was a simple framed photograph. The 2 of them sitting by the pool earlier that day, the sunlight catching the water behind them, both of them looking tired but content. On the back, he had written a few words in his careful, deliberate script. "Because sometimes standing still is the bravest thing you can do." Cassidy smiled, the emotion catching in her throat. She hugged Thomas briefly, grateful beyond words for the bond they had forged, for the quiet courage they had shared. Then she tucked the frame under her arm, stepped out into the cool evening air, and made her way home. Silver Pines would never be perfect. No community ever was. But it was better now, stronger in ways that mattered most. And Cassidy knew as she walked beneath the darkening sky, that she had found something here that was worth fighting for. Not just peace, but justice, and the simple, stubborn belief that even in the smallest of places, even in the quietest of battles, decency could prevail.